Hello, my name is Stein Farstvold, as said, and welcome to my presentation that I've given the title Environmental Archaeology, Is It a Choice? Question mark. The presentation is a bit rough in the edges and based on ongoing research, but I hope it will bring up some important points towards a potential radical manifesto for new environmental archaeologies. I will start with the statement that the environmental aspects in archaeology are not just pertinent in understanding the distant past, it is also very relevant in understanding the recent past, present day, or even the future. My presentation will be given from the perspective of contemporary archaeology. That is not just that I'm interested in the recent time, but I'm rather interested in the contemporary landscape of today and tomorrow that include the accumulated and persisting material vestiges of all past together. Accordingly, my perspective, archaeology is not exclusively a discipline of a distant, absent, and past, but instead a constellation of methods, theories, epistemologies, and practices that mainly deal with the tangible and observable things in the present day. The main and general points in this presentation is that archaeological heritage and artifacts are in their ecological effects and physicality inherently environmental. Thus, the connection between archaeology and the environment is not really a choice, but rather something inherent in dealing with the material world. This connects to the theme given to my presentation, namely artifacts and their relationships are not least components of environments. This might seem like a self-evident and non-controversial statement, but as I will discuss later, this becomes very visible and not least pertinent looking at material heritage from the recent and contemporary past. To discuss these points, I will focus on heritage management and proposed legislation in Norway that explicitly deals with the connect between cultural heritage with environmentalist agendas such as sustainability and diversity. This will later in the presentation be illustrated by a case study from northern Norway, namely the remains of a World War II German Luftwaffe storage camp located in the landscape protection area in Pasvik, as you can see in the map. To give a bit background on this statement, it is necessary the brief introduction of my current work. As said, I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Tromsø on the unruly heritage and archaeology of the Anthropocene project. Broadly speaking, the aim of this project is to, quote, to investigate how the haunting, ruin, and stranded material legacies of the Anthropocene challenge current conception of heritage and urge us to adopt more accommodating and complex understandings, unquote. Accordingly, it is a research project that has a particular understanding of concept, or perhaps more accurately, the phenomenon of heritage. To quote Bjørnar Olsen and Tora Petersdottir from the article Unruly Heritage, Tracing the Legacy in the Anthropocene, quote, in this project we are concerned with how memory is affected and enabled by both things, endurance, and processes of ruination, and also with the involuntary commemoration involving in living and unruly heritage affects understanding of the past, present, and future, unquote. On the background of this framework, my research focused on the material aftermath of World War II in northern Norway, as mentioned, which I have given the title Aftermath, the Nature of War. As the name insinuates, I'm not just interested in what happened in a narrow segment of time in a distant past, but rather how the physical past lingers on and continue to influence the present day, hence the emphasis on aftermath. More specifically, this project aimed to explore the intersection between modern ruin landscape and natural environments. Here I'm especially interested in nature areas that are in some way protected, like wildlife reserves and biotope refuges, which also host unruly material heritage from the recent past that might at first seem at odds with environmental conservation values and aims. Accordingly, my research rests on the premise that there is a significant link between archaeological heritage and the environment, and how we conceptualize this is very significant. For example, to understand artifacts from the war in northern Norway can not only look what happened during the war, but we must also take into consideration how these things continue today to shape and be an instinctive part of natural environment and ecological processes. To do this is unavoidable in some way to touch upon both the methods and theories that are categorized as environmental archaeology. This connects to the central topic of this talk. This can be illuminated in the context of some recent development in Norwegian state and cultural heritage legislation. Let's see. The 16th of June in 2020, the report with the title Nye mål i kulturmiljøpolitikken, engasjement, bærekraft og mangfold, translated to English as New Goals in Culture Environmental Policy, Commitment, Sustainability and Diversity, was approved by the Norwegian Parliament Stortinget. This report to the Storting was drafted by the current ruling government and outlined potential future policies, like forming the foundation for proposition of new laws in the future. It is important to note that despite there being experts involved in creating this report, it's an explicitly political document, as it's drafted under guidance by politicians appointed by the government cabinet. These reports were written by the cabinet led by Prime Minister Erna Solberg from the right-wing conservative party Høyre. I will not give a comprehensive summary of the report, but instead point out some of the core points that are relevant for the role of the environment with regards to archaeological heritage. The Norwegian Directorate for Cultural Heritage refers it to as a, quote, report to the parliament with a green profile, unquote. The first and foremost thing to point out is the explicit focus on kulturmiljø, or directly translated to English as culture environment. The report tells us in translation, quote, with this report, the government introduces the term culture environment as a collective term. It covers the terms cultural monuments, cultural environments, and landscape, and is used when they are referred to as a whole. The concept of cultural environment emphasizes the importance of wholeness and context, while at the same time making connection to the climate and environmental policies clearer, unquote. Generalized, the underlying aim of the report is to make way for more holistic policy that will develop into more comprehensive planning. This is to instead look at cultural heritage and environmental concerns as two separate categories. They are something that relates to each other. For example, the report uses the example of the reuse of old architecture. It argues that preserving or protecting or reusing old buildings impact the climate and environment less than constructing new buildings. There is also the implicit focus on the terms diversity and sustainability repeated in the report. One of the main statement is that, quote, cultural environment shall contribute to sustainable development, unquote. This connects to the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are accounted for in the Transformation of the World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Plan. The Norwegian Directorate for Cultural Heritage, Riksantikvaren, ends its news bulletin on the newly approved report that, translated to English, quote, good cultural heritage protection is also good environmental protection, unquote. However, is it as straightforward as that? A little bit over 2 months after the Cultural Environment Report was approved by the Storting, a critical debate article concerning some of the content was published in Norwegian academic news magazine Kunnskapsavisen Krono. The articles were written by Kristin Bakken, the CEO of NIKU, and the sociologist Joar Skred, also employed at NIKU, the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, a huge player in the research and heritage management aspect of Norway. The title of the article is Kulturminnepolitikk i utakt med internasjonal forskning, that can be translated to English as Cultural Heritage Policy out of step with international research. The central claim in this article is that by connecting cultural heritage closer to the issue of and fields of surrounding climate and the environment by using terms like cultural environment will weaken the holistic understanding of cultural heritage and monuments, and thus make heritage that deals with understanding ourselves less important. Therefore, they argue, Norwegian policy stand on the sideline when compared to the leading international cultural heritage research. Contrary to how the report reads, they argue that cultural environment policy and cultural heritage policy are fundamentally different things. Why do they think this? They argue it is because of categorical conflation with the deviate from the definition of heritage, that's singular, used by what they claim is the forefront of international research. They agree that there's synergetic relationship between material and immaterial heritage, for example, between Sami reindeer herding traditions and the landscape, but argues in the end that, translates to English, quote, perhaps it is the intangible cultural heritage that's ultimately the most important, unquote. This ties in the argument that connecting heritage and the environment is too closely together will suppress the human personal identity, feelings, and even culture itself. It would be wrong, they argue, to make culture a subcategory of social sustainability. In the end, they conclude that politics displayed in its report demonstrate that the suggested policies are moving away from the memory-based relationship people have with cultural heritage, as is implicitly pointed out in its in vogue in international research. This they see as an unfortunate development. Here they implicitly employ the idea of memory as intangible and exclusively internal human phenomenon. In my interpretation, the argument against merging environmental and cultural understanding and management of heritage is that physical heritage, like artifacts and tangible landscape, are subordinate to and a result of higher anthropocentric processes like identity and action that always come before the things. This I find problematic and a bit ironically outdated assumption. First, if the assertion that all archaeology is an environment, first, if the assertion that all archaeology is environmental archaeology is true, it must also cover heritage archaeology and archaeological heritage, the part of archaeology practice that deals with the management and discussion of archaeological artifacts and such in the present day. But is that possible if previously claimed that heritage and environment policy are generally incommensurable because of the way humans remember and use memory? I find the critique by Bakken and Skede have some good points about being careful not to overlook individual, collective, and non-tangible memories and heritage while drafting heritage proposal. However, I do not support the polemics and hierarchical segmentation of material and the immaterial, and that memory is separated from the environment itself. If that is the definition used by what the authority claim is the leading reasons front of heritage studies, I feel a bit left out. The very much ongoing unruly heritage research probably explicitly employ concepts of heritage in relation to ecology and environment. Are we not amongst what they define as the leading research front in heritage studies? Perhaps not, at least. I will not want to be a part of that if heritage is treated as something that must be kept separate from the environment. Diametrically opposed to the line of reasoning used by Kristin Bakke and Johan Skred, I think the Cultural Environment Report seriously lack a broad and reflective implementation of environmental understanding of material heritage. It is not really environmental enough. This is in the report, there's a lot of talk about sustainability and diversity. But if you look for information about Norway's arguably largest material legacy, namely the remnants of products of natural gas and petroleum industry, you end up with nothing. There's nothing written about it in the report. I find it ironic that document delay the framework of future cultural environment management mentioned difficult territories like Norwegianization of indigenous people and slave labor camps for World War II, but someone avoids mentioning examples of material heritage as environmental change and harm, except in brief example talking about partly cleaning up after the Svea mine on Svalbard. Should not heritage, like the meters-deep, noxious organic sediments poisoned by medical chemicals under salmon aquaculture farms, or the thousands of heavily eroded shorelines on hydroelectric reservoir lakes in Norwegian mountains, also be mentioned? The report mentioned that, quote, measures to reduce greenhouse gas emission can sometimes hurt cultural heritage values. It is telling that erosion belts around the hydroelectric dams or wind farms in Sápmi reindeer herding territories are absent when cultural values or cultural environments are mentioned. These examples are just as much artifacts, in my assessment, as Mesolithic flint debitage and the remnants of Iron Age bloomeries. The enormous diversity and multiplicity of artifacts, material heritage, is overlooked by its report's greenwashing and Bakken and Skrede's polarized polemics of material versus intangible heritage. If one upholds a strict dichotomy between tangible and intangible, with a prioritized and hierarchical emphasis on the latter, then artifacts are relegated to be less important and highly relativized. It's quite ironic how much things that have been categorized as intangible is so much about the tangible, like the blacksmith's touch on the hammer and the clang of the anvil, and the very tangible nature of speech and language from the lips, tongue, and the palate, shaping breath into words. Oh, how the tangible morphological likeness of a glacier or Attic stone has of a bear inspired the tales of veneration. We are touched and intertouched by things in so many different ways, even when we can't feel the touch. For example, you cannot separate cultural heritage and climate change into two separate spheres, both theoretically and not least politically. It must be noted that things are usually defined as intangible heritage and such have a connection to the very tangible environment that surrounds it. First, immaterial heritage, like how we live with cars, oil, and coal-heated houses, or not, drive or are directly connected to and affected by the climate and how it changes and fluctuates. Identity and self-expression are also informed by and in turn influences and intersects with the environment through, for example, ideologies and consumption. How and what we remember and transmit memories intangibly very much a part and impact the environment. Secondly, climate change in and of itself, both as processes and not least artifacts and artificially concentration of matter, are heritage. There are our legacies, not everybody's, but mostly us. For example, the Cultural Environment report talks about how climate change and pollution threaten heritage. But what happens when the heritage is pollution or is a part of what drives or still drive climate change and extinction? Anthropogenic changes in the climate are material memories that embed themselves in the environment and is very apparent from the methods and perspectives of environmental archaeologies. That's why preservation of, for example, bogs and wetlands are a matter of protecting accumulated memories. Through, for example, preserved pollen or other proxies that offer a record of variation in the environment. One can thus argue that all nature reserves or areas designated to protect nature and environment are also archaeological reserves. Archaeological reserves is a term used by the treatise of the European Convention on the Protection of Archaeological Heritage to denote areas that are protected against invasive extraction and disturbance of archaeological things. Here it's important to reflect on the non-neutral aspects of environmental impacts embedded in personal understandings of the self and collective and individual memories that is emphasized by Bakken and Skrede. It's important not to reduce heritage as only something good or directly connected to personal collective identity, creation, and maintenance. For example, a lot of heritage is about the disassociation, discomfort, even condemnation, like Nazi extermination camps, marine plastic litter, to colonial settler architecture, and hydroelectric dams. Another aspect important to note is that heritage is not always willful or intentionally nor controlled by selection and curation, both when it comes to the tangible and intangible. Memories can also be involuntary. It seems like both the report and the following critical article operates with a rather naive definition of cultural heritage as something that must be labeled and recognized to exist. What we inherit, and thus also the environment at large, mostly consists of things we are not willfully or intentionally chosen as heritage and to be preserved. When Bakken and Skrede argues that heritage is mostly intangible and connected to person identification and memory, they miss the wider present effects of material heritage and artifacts that inhabit the world. The anthropocentric and factually wrong assertion that it's primarily humans that have a culture, or like in current leading research of culture among primates, chitosaurs, and not least extinct hominid cultures, is symptomatic for a position that internalized heritage to only be relevant for and within human minds. Anthropocentric and exclusionary definition of culture ignore environments and ecological processes that cultural heritage is a part of. This can further extended and theorized in frameworks like, for example, extended evolutionary hypothesis. Extremely briefly said, and from my incomplete understanding, this theory extends evolutionary heredity beyond just genetics to also include the physical environment itself and niche creation. If archaeologists employ such models on human societies in the past, is ought also apply to contemporary and not least future societies. The niches that are carved out today and maintained are very much part of the landscape and create ecological inheritance that we both are and are not cognizant of. And then I find the suspicious treatment of the concept of environment as a rather strange thing in the current circumstances. With the accelerated global warming, rampant consumerism, the COVID epidemic, and not least the ongoing anthropogenic mass extinction event. Here I think it's important to emphasize that archaeology is not only about discovering and understanding something that was or has been, it's also about exploring the current, existing, or something very much alive anthropogenic artifacts to shape the present and the future. This, in my opinion, must be one of the core axioms of a radical new manifesto for new environmental archaeologies. The thing with artifacts is that they're persistent beyond their intended use and lifespan. In artifactual memories, as old as the Paleolithic, are today affecting how we think and perceive the world and the environment through research and physical encounters with the material. First, whether we willfully support it or not, artifacts from the deep past will keep seeping into the present and challenge our understanding through their artifactual presences. Secondly, we must also frame the archaeological artifacts are not based around only how we understand the past, but also how it's inherited and appropriated by the environment and non-humans as a continuum. Our memories are habitats, lively substrates, and sometimes the death of other species. These points, I argue, are perhaps somewhat speculative, but they draw on the empirical observation and experience from concrete cases. Some of these points are informed by and can be illustrated by my post-Koto case study, namely the aforementioned remnants of a Nazi Luftwaffe storage camp from World War II by Jökosen in Pasvik. That is a place where the spare parts of airplanes and other war material was stored. But first, a bit background on this case study. In 2019, archaeologists at the University of Tromsø, mainly Bjørnar, were contacted by the Pasvik National Park, which offered to fund a surface survey to map the camp that was located within the landscape protection area. Such landscape protection areas are in Norway under the Naturmangfoldloven, that is the Nature Diversity Law in English, designated as sites where a conjoined natural culture environment is protected. The park manager, Rolf Kolström, told us this was linked to an initiative of trilateral cooperation between nature reserves over the border in Finland and Russia, where they wanted to document heritage from the Second World War. The area with the Luftwaffe camp was also in the consideration to be deregulated to allow logging. Therefore, to map and thus acknowledge the presence of war remains there could strengthen the argument to not deregulate. Accordingly, a peculiar situation emerged where the flora, fauna, and archaeological remains, because of their unintended entanglement, coalesced into a mutual struggle to avoid erasure and destruction. The survey documented a total of 319 archaeological structures in and around the camp. For example, among them were 196 firing positions, 30 barrack ruins, 13 depot areas, 8 middens, 7 latrines, 9 sand pits, 5 trenches, 4 wells, 4 possible Skoltsami house ruins, and traces of a prisoner of war camp. Related to structure were a large amount of artifacts visible lying on the surface and hidden underneath the accumulated soil and vegetation. Interesting, before the recent initiative of surveying the war remains in the park, it was, and still is, in some instances, seen as mostly litter and pollution by the authorities and often local people. As recent as the last 2 decades, there has been a concentrated effort to remove what in the local municipal document name as war waste, krigsavfall, and iron scrap, jernskrap. For me, at least, the war remains here had a very real presence and a part of the environment, and not least the unique landscape. As such, the resulting survey report argued that the war remains should be treated as a part of the conjoined natural culture environment that makes up the unique and distinct character of the landscape protection area. Despite the recent efforts to clean up war remains, scavenging in the post-war years, and the metal detecting and looting in the last couple of decades, there's still enormous amount of ruins and artifacts dotting the landscape. The war has made a permanent impact not only on the identities and local collective memories of people, but is also permanently embedded environmentally memories into the chemical and geomorphic character of the landscape of the Pacific River Valley. One cannot, in this example, make a clear distinction between artifactual heritage after a war and environment at large on the other side. It's not really a choice one can make. However, we interpret the operation of the Luftwaffe camp and gather local recollection of the past. Its environmental entanglement and ecological presence are still significant beyond that, like this recent article, among other things, discusses. It is instances like this, environmental perspectives and methods in archaeology is indispensable in not only understanding the impact of the past on today's environment, but also how to negotiate and manage these appropriately unruly artifacts. To do this, it is necessary to break away from the assumption that heritage can be easily separated into things that are environmentally inert and good. Why exactly is environmental archaeology important for archaeological heritage management and understanding? First, environmental methods and perspective are important in avoiding the bias of visible and the known. Extra anthropocentric sensing is part of scientific methods, like, for example, soil chemistry and other geoarchaeological methods. To make sense of the environment is not to observe only through human sensory organs. Archaeology does not only reveal things that are hidden in a distant past, but it also discloses things that are hidden in plain sight in and of the present day. As mentioned in the survey report we made for the Øvre Pacific National Park and Landscape Protection Area, we argued that the inclusion and this protection of artifacts and structure from the World War II and the cultural heritage landscape should also include the soil within the camp as an important and unique character of the landscape protection area. Chemical elements traces can contain invaluable information because they, for example, lack any significant visible above traces of Nazi labor camps at Jökulsen. The visible subterranean soils become even more valuable. Archaeology can, with the help of environmental and natural scientific methods, uncover and recover memories that are lost to the living and collective memory. Several other excavations of German World War II slave labor camps that participated in Northern Norway support this. For example, during the rescue excavation of the POW camp in Kalvik, the Tromsø archaeologist Johan Arntzen and I systematically sampled the soil in the camp in an arbitrary grid. Johan analyzed the soil sample with X-ray fluorescence and, among other things, looked at the non-natural concentration of an element of arsenic and lead. Concentration of different elements, for example, give us clue about the toxic living condition the prisoners endure, but also the different kinds of activities they did in the spare time within the camp, like metalworking and smelting. These signals in the soil are important in understanding the spatial use of a camp. For example, because how the barracks and other materials was systematically removed and disposed of after a war. This also demonstrated the utility of environmental archaeological methods to understand and visualize the recent, past, and present day. Toxic artifacts and the diffusion of chemicals into the environment are, of course, a concern. In 2012, the Sweco Norge AS carried out an environmental technical investigation at two demarcated locations at the Luftwaffe camp on the behalf of the park board. These sites contained 2 mounds of rusty barrels. The sampling revealed that the barrels contained high values of both hydrocarbons and PCBs. It is important to note that the report states that the values were too low for the material to be defined as hazardous waste. In 2013, 16.9 tons of mass was removed, which included 20 to 30 centimeters of underlying soil. But was this necessary? How big an impact on the environment did this concentration of pollution have versus its experiential cultural value? Before the removal, it would be advantageous to combine both archaeological reflective understanding of artifacts and natural scientific expertise. Instead of greenwashing heritage, this shows how we need to, for a serious and not least political engagement with environmental archaeological methods, or even an environmentalist archaeology instead of a conservativist archaeology. Even if it were for the best that the barrels and contaminated topsoil were removed, archaeological documentation of the artifact before their destruction would have been beneficial. Environmental archaeological methods are very important in detecting, recognizing, measuring, and thus acknowledging the different kinds of impact of anthropogenic artifacts have on environments and not least as environments. This also taps into the ideological and political ecology of archaeological heritage. Are there perhaps some symbolically laden artifact best left in the soil? That some artifacts protected from being removed from the soil is both environmentally sound action that reduces negative anthropization and simultaneously keep them away from an ethically and politically dubious economy of trade, exploitation, or even recontextualization of identity and symbols. Deactivating artifacts might be a part of an activist and an environmentalist archaeological practice. This implementation of archaeological nature culture reserve can perhaps be a useful tool in this instance. In the future, archaeologists making impact assessments of archaeological sites cannot continue to assess the cases unilaterally. That is, archaeologists must think bilaterally. That is not only about how, for example, increased erosion and humidity negatively impact preservation of archaeological heritage, but also how archaeological heritage is interlinked with their mind and the ecology in many ways, both detrimentally and perhaps often beneficially. Here it will be key to implement both a sound scientific methods to understand these things in a natural culture ecological framework together with humanistic reflexivity and political sensitivity. Secondly, environmental archaeology is important in understanding biological matter. Living memory and heritage do not only refer to what exists within minds of living humans. Archaeological botanic experience is now commonly used in all kinds of archaeological sites and has since the 1800s. One is perhaps used to think archaeology only researches dead and a living context, but the archaeological record also includes a lot of living biotic tissue and things. During the survey of the Luftwaffe camp, for example, I observed raspberry bushes growing on top of some of the middens. These are plants which are not native to the regional flora of Pacific Valley. The shrubs grew probably from the seed deposited in midden by the Nazis, or even the slave laborers and the prisoners of war, civilians, Ostarbeiders that built most of the camp. These raspberry bushes can be defined as Pulimoshore, a scientific term that was coined by the Finnish botanist Pano Mannerkopi in the aftermath of World War II. It denotes plants that have inadvertently been spread beyond their natural habitats by war activities. The entanglement of botany and war has been a topic since World War I. In a paper published in 1917 named Stratobotanique, the Swiss botanist Albert Helling described researcher who looking at how war uniquely impacted plant colonization and population in the war-torn landscape, such as the battlefields of World War I. Albert, for example, mentioned how the now famous red poppy thrived among the barbed wire obstacles. Perennial plants like trees are excellent example of living archaeological context. This can be illustrated by a couple of recent articles from northern Norway on what the researchers have coined warfare dendrochronology. In this study, the researchers detected the presence of the German warship Tirpitz in the annual growth rings of pine and birch trees in Kåfjord. To hide from the Allied aircraft bombings, the crew used artificial smoke of chlorosulfonic acid and zinc. This caused defloration and stunted the growth of the trees for up to 9 years afterwards. It's pertinent here to note that anthropogenic artifacts that one usually associates with human history and culture are also relevant for non-human beings and even processes. Modern war remains from the industrial warfare of the 20th century has a very complex and inadvertent ecological impact. Like, for example, forming the basis of diverse non-human habitats after the abandonment. Such a structure are used for a very short time, but persist in their abandonment for a very much longer time. For example, in a recent case study on abandoned bunkers in farmlands of continental Europe, it is noted that these structures sometimes today, 75 years after the war happened, functioned as refuge for a diverse set of wildlife in an otherwise non-diverse landscape of intensive farmlands. The same study also notes that it's something necessary to maintain and protect these bunker habitats, quote, to preserve the local biodiversity. Thirdly, artifacts and things are a part of and affected by ecological succession and processes. One of the endpoints in implementing a critical environmental archaeological understanding of archaeological heritage is to see human-made artifacts and anthropogenic matter as things that are always part of natural processes such as ecological succession and nutrient cycles. That heritage is not always something that must be protected from the environment, that is also a part of natural processes, whether intended or not. The vestiges of a German lookout tower located in Luftwaffe camp is an illustrative example of this. In the landscape protection era, it falls under two distinctive protection categories. First, the culture as a component of the landscape that make up the camp. Secondly, it is through the park stipulation specifically protected from human disturbance because of it consists of dead Scots pine wood. Here we have an example of an artifact that is environmentally significant and ecologically important because of its substrate and nourishment for organisms that contribute to the area's biodiversity. To understand heritage environmentally, it necessary to acknowledge the ecological function of nutrient cycle, entropy, metabolism, etc. This necessitated perspectives, not necessarily expertise in natural scientific knowledge, that at least employ some kind of insight in such processes. Archaeology does not end above the topsoil. It is even part of the horizontal stratigraphy of living trees to the atmosphere itself and beyond. Most archaeological artifacts can be talked as a composite natural culture objects, as this lookout tower. It's important to point out that artifactual archaeological heritage not only exist as repositories of identity and knowledge, they're also simultaneously environmental actors. Heritage is something that also impacts non-humans. To conclude the question posed in the title of the talk, no, in my experience, and with regards to the assertion that archaeology is the discipline of things par excellence, archaeological context is always in some way or form connected and a part of the environment. Environmental archaeology puts another dimension to heritage management in the present day and future. How do we manage the excess of anthropogenic artifacts and structures, both intended and unintended, in the present day and future? A lot is talked about archaeological sites are non-removable, but instead it's important to emphasize there has been and is a current accelerated accumulation of anthropogenic artifacts and matter. Some archaeology is, of course, erased by new development and such, but the biggest and most environmental fact is that artifacts accumulate more and more in the biosphere, the stratosphere, the cryosphere, geosphere, in outer space. One can even say there's an enormous accumulation of archaeological artifacts and intangible information in the disused part of the anthropogenic noosphere. That is the collective knowledge and encoded information floating around the books and not least the internet. It's arguably in the management of and the legislations that surround archaeological heritage where potentially the most direct interface between politics and environmental archaeology resides. Accordingly, theoretically, methodologically, and other developments in academic and research-oriented archaeology can and probably will percolate to and have a practical or real impact on the environments like Pacific. Today, it's crucial that archaeological heritage does not only include symbolically and historically problematic things, like extermination camps for World War II or statues of colonial slave owners and the discussion what they involve or should not all, but also environmental problematic artifacts like barbed wire or even ever-increasing remains of toxic human bodies. This also includes a curatorial bias that material heritage is something that needs protection from the environment, but also how heritage in return have negative, positive, and neutral effects on the natural cultural environment it is a part of. If archaeology is indeed unruly, archaeological practice can perhaps function as a reflexive interlocutor. Archaeology can be a reactive instead of passive in both predicting and intervening or even upholding non-intervention. And perhaps in this environmentally oriented framework, archaeology needs to be part of a curriculum of primary and high school. This does not primarily have to do with telling linear cultural histories, how things progressed linearly from the Paleolithic times up to the medieval times, but instead focus on the unique core of archaeology as practice. instead of focusing on teaching products of archaeology, it's also perhaps more pertinent to teach the process of archaeology and the ways to understand anthropogenic environments. Archaeology is much more than analogy. To introduce pupils to the natural environment outside the classroom, let them do garbological analysis, and look at the archaeological layering of built environments. Let them into the apparent wilderness and show them the overgrown burial mounds and buried 20th century landfills. Make natural and cultural formation processes visible. To ask questions such as how come things look as they do today and what will happen to them in the future? As students in their science and nature class learn about ecology and naming birds, let them also learn about and name archaeological traces in the local environment, from petroglyphs to aerosol spray graffiti and abandoned strip mines. As they learn to look up in the sky and the star and the planets, they can also learn to look down on the ground and the floors they tread on. Let instill not only a historical consciousness, but also an environmentally grounded archaeological consciousness. Archaeology, beyond the arbitrary disciplinary chronological boundaries, very much deal and interact with things that are present all around us and are part of much larger environments. In mediating knowledge and practice, let's jump out of the usual stratigraphic sandboxes and pedagogic trace of ancient potsherds and flint, and instead introduce people to the things they already surround and not at least influences them. These are some of the radical statements, or not least practice, a must embrace if you truly believe archaeology has something to contribute. Thank you for listening.